What is good, my beautiful people? So, welcome to another SK Wealth Academy podcast. Again, for those of you that are new, you can always find the downloadable MP3 audio files of all my podcasts at skwealthacademy.podbean.com. For those of you that follow me on YouTube, I apologize for not uploading as regularly as in the past. But as I've explained, because if you're new, then you might not know, but I've explained in the past the reason I'm not uploading as frequently is because YouTube is really stifling my channel. I've never been monetized. The channel's been up for over a year now, and they say they're still reviewing it for monetization, which is ridiculous. So obviously they don't plan to monetize it. They're probably planning to ban it completely altogether. So being that all this content on social media platforms is completely free and I don't earn any income from it, I'm not willing to spend like 3-4 hours, and often the only time I have to do this to research this is at like 4 or 5 in the morning to put in that kind of effort if I'm going to be throttled and reach the minimum amount of people possible, especially since I do all this for free. So basically the content creation will increase once I switch to another platform, and that will probably be k.im. So make a mental note of that, k.im. If you see my channel go completely dark, that either means I've been banned completely by YouTube or that I've just switched over to k.im. So let's get started. So what's the subject and topic of today's podcast? Well, even though we still have 6 weeks left in the year of 2020, I am going to award the 2020 SK Wealth Academy Man of the Year. And I'm going to give it to the Unthinking Compliant Pod. Now, as you all know, Time Magazine has their Man of the Year every year, and they award that particular distinction, which I say with sarcasm because usually some person that really hasn't done anything great. I think a couple of years ago they gave it to Greta Thunberg. Can't remember who it was last year, or maybe last year Greta won it. But really, the reason I am awarding the SK Wealth Academy Man of the Year, because I'm going to continue the tradition of Time Magazine in making that award a complete joke, and being that I am from Philly and I'm a sarcastic person at heart, the nature of my award's going to be very sarcastic too. So I'm going to give it to the Unthinking Compliant Pod, because the heights of stupidity and lack of critical thinking has soared to even greater heights this year than it has in last year. And we see again the ruling classes, what they're doing to strip our liberties. We've seen the reaction around the world that has confirmed that the Unthinking Compliant Pod is now numbers in the billions of people around the world. And some of these other lack of critical thinking behavior that I've seen manifest this year are beliefs that an elected candidate from an utterly corrupt and rotten political system in a national election will bring meaningful change to people of all socioeconomic and racial demographics. Because for those that hated President Trump and are now so happy that it pretty much looks like the next president, although this won't be confirmed officially until a month from now, December 14th, that it will be President Joe Biden. At least, at a minimum, Trump was going after the censorship of all these social media platforms. So you know that's just going to be rolled back, because Biden is even more of a puppet to the ruling class than Trump ever was. So you know that all of this type of news, if you've enjoyed in the past, good luck finding it, because once Biden becomes president, that censorship hammer is going to rain down hard upon people like me. So you're going to have less access to truthful information. You're going to have less access, probably more war, because as I mentioned in the past, the Democratic and Republican Party have kind of switched on the war stance. Now the Democratic Party is much more in favor of war and military war. What I mean by that, so I don't mean Trump was not a war president, but he basically enacted war through economic sanctions, through economic war, other means that were still devastating and likely killed hundreds of thousands of people, say in Venezuela, Syria, so on, Yemen. But we're going to get, along with those economic sanctions still being in place, we're going to get a lot more bombings now, probably under Biden. So it's just like the choice in which I say that the heights of stupidity are exhibited when people think real positive change for all people of all socioeconomic and racial demographics is ever going to be implemented by a major party candidate is because a party is, the political system is utterly corrupt. So how can an utterly corrupt political system provide a candidate that's actually going to help people like you and me? So, of course, a candidate of the political parties that dominate the national election, whether in the Netherlands, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, or any other nation, not just in the United States, will always continue to enact policies that only serve the very top tier of the wealthiest class only. And the wealthy will continue to become much wealthier, as we saw under the viral lockdown situations when the world's top billionaires added, I believe it was a cumulative wealth, don't quote me on this, but I believe it was in the hundreds of billions of dollars they added, maybe even close to $500 billion cumulatively. I can't recall off the top of my head. I don't have that in my notes. But obviously, the uber obscenely wealthy class became even wealthier under the lockdown. So they never get hurt by all the measures basically enforced by politicians that hurt us. And the middle class keeps descending into the poor. And of course, the poor become even poorer until they die of hunger and starvation. So this is a pattern that's been in play for at least the past 4 decades and will continue to be the pattern in play as long as we, the Unthinking Compliant Pods, keep thinking real positive change can come out of participating in the absolutely rotten political system and nominating another major party candidate to lead our nation. So to me, I call all those people that believe this sleepwalkers. They continue sleepwalking and to continue to inexplicably support the dominant political system in their nations. Although the only guaranteed outcome of this support is that we will be further controlled and further stripped of our basic human rights, whether that's to hug each other, to shake hands, because like the absurdity of that some of these medical doctors are part of this corrupt system say like we will never shake hands again for the rest of our lives. It's just anyone that has a gram of common sense can understand the absurdity of these types of declarations that are to instill obedience and numbing lack of critical thought within humanity, and not to for our own good or our own safety or to improve our health. That's just basic rubbish. And the fact that people cannot see this is what is generally truly frightening and disturbing. It's disturbing to me that, for example, Americans, that they celebrated the Joe Biden win, at least it's announced by the media, because I said it's not official until December 14th, that they celebrated his win as we saw with the same levels of bliss we observed people in history celebrate the end of World War II. Because like that was really something to celebrate, the end of World War II. The types of celebrations that went on by Unthinking Compliant Pods in celebration to Biden's win is just unbelievable to me. So some people compare that type of fervor as attributable to the ignorance is bliss narrative because they don't understand the inner workings of the real political system. So they're just ignorant, so that's why they're so blissful. To even the more widespread manifestation of Stockholm syndrome, which if you don't know what that is, I assume most people do, but if you don't, it's the syndrome in which the prisoner becomes emotionally attached and even supportive of their own captor, even though the captor is abusing them. So I choose to explain the inexplicable support of the captive for their captors, not through Stockholm syndrome, but through the much simpler perspective as a consequence of critical thinking development having been systemically stripped from all schooling in all 193 nations in the world today at every level. So this starts from grade school level, critical thinking stripped from very young children, through middle school, through high school, through the university collegiate level, and even through the postdoctoral level. So having graduated from an Ivy League university myself, having 2 postgraduate degrees myself, I've certainly observed a fair share of Harvard and Wharton MBAs and PhDs in economics exhibit dumb as rock levels of critical thinking. People say, oh, you got an MBA from Wharton. Oh, you got a PhD from Harvard. You must be so smart. And they don't understand that some of these people, because I've interacted with a lot of them, generally have a dumb as rock level of critical thinking unless they have self-educated themselves and extracted a lot of critical thinking skills outside of the institutional academic system. So they can simultaneously, but not contradictorily, exhibit brilliant levels of theoretical and conceptual knowledge in whatever their field of study was in academics, while still exhibiting dumb as rock levels of critical thinking. So that's what people don't understand. It's not contradictory to be really brilliant in your field of study, but still dumb as a rock when it comes to critical thinking. So a major debate that sparked massive protests in the US and across the world earlier this year was whether does racism exist at a systemic level in law enforcement. But I believe the more important debate is whether academic schooling has become so devoid of critical thinking that it systemically is the key word here, right? Dumbs down every student it processes and it spits out with robes, caps, and diplomas in hand. So I think there's a real serious argument given the observations of mass expressions of stupidity across humanity all over the world this year, on every continent on planet Earth, that this unfortunately is the case. So, for example, just a couple weeks ago, I released a podcast. I think it was 153, but certainly you can go to skwealthacademy.podbean.com to find it. It was titled Misanthropocene, the Age of Perpetual Warfare and Deception. And I warn people two things. I say that anyone that doesn't understand that we have been in perpetual war, and I'm going to just put this in relation to U.S. politicians. So we've been in perpetual war through the Bush, Clinton, Obama, and Trump administrations. That's Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. It's not looking at war properly, because I stated a world war today, not just wars between like two different nations, but a world war will never be waged in the same manner it was waged during World War II. Back in 1945, unless a particular psychopathic leader is selected by the ruling class to engage the world in nuclear war and just destroy all of humanity. In that case, okay, there's a possibility. But if a truly psychopath, I know most of you will listen to this and say, what are you talking about? Most prime ministers and presidents are psychopaths. But I'm saying like a psychopath of an extreme level would be necessary to wage nuclear war, right? So, unless one of these types of leaders are put in power, not elected, but selected by the ruling class, I argue that World War III has already been ongoing for many, many years now, because war has not only been waged among nations through more covert means. So, we don't necessarily have to have the Obama administration dropping bombs through drones on innocent Afghans and innocent Yemenis and whatnot, but we can have like I said, the Trump administration waging war through economic wars that starve and kill millions of people through economic sanctions. So instead of bombs delivered by fighter pilots and drones causing death, we just have sanctions causing death, mass death. So, but also within many nations through this virus scapegoated lockdown enforced worldwide by political tyrants, we also have civil war. So we have war of governments against the people. And so we've had just mass war across the entire world this year, 2020. So I also warned in that podcast that I released that podcast by a full 2 weeks before the US national elections for the POTUS, President of the United States, in response to many false and unethical claims that global lockdowns would immediately end, or maybe unethical is not a correct word, maybe uncritical. Okay, that's a better word. Uncritical claims that, hey, if Biden gets elected, then all the lockdowns are going to be over, because they say all the lockdowns around the world have just been about getting Joe Biden elected and getting Trump out. And I said, that's ridiculous. I said in that podcast that this is about the most uncritical way of perceiving the true mission of these lockdowns within a very nationalistic lens. I said, why would every other country, why would Spain support getting Trump out? Why would France support it? Why would Australia? You tell me every single country that's enforcing the same kind of unethical, tyrannical lockdowns is doing this to help sway the U.S. presidential election. I said that type of thing displays a complete lack of intellect. And not only that, in that podcast, I said, look, these lockdowns are not going to end upon a Biden win. And some Republicans were just so angry with me for saying that. They'll say, you'll see, after he wins, this is just to get Trump out, that lockdowns will end. And what did we already receive? Because although Biden cannot take, obviously, the presidency and cannot be declared the official president until December 14th, and he's not going to assume office until January 20th, I believe. Is it the 20th or 21st of next year? I think it's January 20th of 2021. He's already, putting together his transition team and his cabinet members. And again, where was this? I know that one of his cabinet members already said that that U.S. American citizens must submit themselves to stricter and more oppressive lockdowns to beat the virus. So again, but as I predicted in that podcast, I said there's going to be no end of lockdowns with a Biden win, no matter who won. So again, no matter if you're Republican, and the whole thing about voter fraud too, it's really interesting because living in Asia, right? Because people are not told what to believe by the mass media. Because you see a very distinct division of belief depending upon your affiliation, if you're Republican or Democrat. But since nobody in Asian countries are Democratic or Republican, it's really interesting that I've spoken to friends of mine in Japan, in Korea, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in a lot of other, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, and a lot of them say, hey, have you heard that there's been a lot of allegations about fraud? Because there's no narrative as in the U.S. mass media that if you say there's a voter fraud, then you're a huge Trump supporter. Because these people are saying that are not Trump supporters. It's just that news is reported completely differently. So that's why I say you're also very much going to become a non-thinking compliant pod if all you do is ingest mass media. Because sometimes I don't even know why people are angry with me when I say certain things, because it conflicts with their beliefs forced down their throat by the mass media. Because I said I haven't watched mass media in 15, 20 years. So when people get so angry, I don't know what I'm supposed to believe. I don't know how I'm supposed to be brainwashed into believing certain narratives. So when I just basically give what I feel is a very subjective opinion about what I'm extracting as facts, sometimes that triggers other people that have just, the only source of their news is mass media because they're being brainwashed to believe a certain narrative. So no matter if you're Republican, Democrat, Democrat, independent, nobody should be, at a minimum, nobody should be against a thorough investigation, right? To determine if these allegations are fraud or true or not. I don't know if they are. And I've even said that in past podcasts I uploaded. I said, I haven't done the serious legwork necessary to decide for myself if I believe in these claims of fraud. Because a lot of things I've heard were anecdotal, right? People just that were part of the counting the vote process that said they witnessed a lot of fraud, but we don't know how reliable those stories are. They could be 100% reliable or they could be completely fake. But at a minimum, I said every American should want to know that America is not descended to the depths of a banana republic where the outcome of an election is completely fraudulent. They should want to know that at a minimum. But again, some people will just say, I don't even care if it was fraudulent. I've heard Democrats say that because their man won, right? And they say it just any means necessary to get the orange clown out of office is good by me. So they don't even care if there's fraud, which is, again, very worrisome when it comes to critical thinking. So anyway, I digress somewhat from my main point, which is that Americans believe politicians enforced viral lockdowns was not part of a wider platform of global control and compliance, but only a political ploy to help Joe Biden get elected. And that obviously clearly was not the case, as this was something that just didn't afflict the United States, but afflicted many nations all across the world. So again, I found it. I did have it in my notes. I was just glancing at it. So the guy that said that lockdowns, that another round of, quote, comprehensive and strict as possible, end quote, 4 to 6 week lockdown period, that essentially amounts to martial law is necessary, is Dr. Michael Osterholm, who's an appointee on Joe Biden's special coronavirus transition advisory team. So obviously lockdowns are going to become worse under Biden, not better, or not just completely lifted, as a lot of people had told me would be the case. So of course, we've been witnessing the age of stupidity for many years now. But I think this year, we've definitely witnessed an acceleration of this progression of the dumbing down of mankind. And like, for example, 2018, we all observed that stupidity has no impregnable barriers. Even at higher income levels, that the extremely wealthy are also susceptible to mass bouts of stupidity, as Elizabeth Holmes invented a completely fake company called Theranos that she said was a revolutionary blood testing company that could run all these sophisticated blood tests on just a pinprick of blood. So you could, prick your finger, get a little tiny minuscule, usually you have to get a vein, and then you have to extract at least a vial of blood to run any kind of comprehensive blood test. But she's like, no, you can get this little thin, tiny vial just by a pinprick of blood and filling out a tiny capillary kind of, capillary in size kind of vial, and mail it in, you'll get all your blood tests. And even though she did not provide a single shred of evidence, I think she provided not one single shred of concrete evidence. Because I remember following this story very closely a couple of years ago, and the way she got around this was saying, this is proprietary intellectual property. I cannot give this up. When people or investors were asking, hey, where's a proof of your test actually working? She said, I can't give that up but yet people continued, instead of questioning, wait a second, why she provided zero proof of, the efficacy of her tests. And why are we continuing to dole out billions of dollars to fund her company without a single shred of her alleged product and single shred of evidence about her alleged product? Because in science, you know what that's called? That's called a theory, right? Because the theories are basically postulated conclusions without any hard, concrete evidence. But scientific theories are even better than what Elizabeth Holmes' scam was, because in scientific theories, usually there's a preponderance of circumstantial evidence that suggests that theory is correct, until sometimes, of course, a theory is disproven with better information at scientists' disposal, and then they scrap that theory and come up with a new theory. But in this case, Elizabeth Holmes didn't even provide a preponderance of circumstantial evidence that her fake scientific blood testing company actually had a valid process. She provided nothing. So the age of stupidity by 2018 was already rising so strongly that a total fraud was able to raise billions of dollars with a theoretical concept, not a real scientific company. And so, again, I have observed the exact same total absence of critical thought when it comes to discussions about the real dangers, not the perceived dangers, the real dangers of this global virus. So perceived danger about the virus likely outweighs the real danger that has been embraced by the masses, at least 10-fold, 20-fold, maybe even 100-fold, depending upon, people's varying degree of belief about the lethality of this virus. But because people are too non-intellectual to understand anything about why they must validate the robustness of statistical methodology before blindly believing reported statistics. And then they don't understand, right, when we see, it's reported that even the fittest people on the planet, professional athletes in their early 20s, that report, oh, I've tested positive, or the league will report that. So the league, the platform of professional sports, is actually being utilized by the ruling class to extend and spread fear mongering and false information about the virus. Because when have you heard any of these pro athletes actually say they had severe symptoms? None. I've not heard any. In fact, most of them said I had no symptoms. You know why? Because they use a test, which I'll get to in a second, that basically produces a very, very high rate of false positives. So they probably never had it to begin with. And the fact that they're in close proximity to each other, especially in sports like basketball or football, sweating all over each other, the fact that there hadn't been a mass outbreak should just, like, people's common sense, they should understand that the contagious aspect of the virus being spread throughout the world is just a whole bunch of bunk. And so, what else did I want to say about that? I just want to say, the fact that the ruling class is using sports leagues to continually spread fear is unsurprising, because modern day sports leagues are the Roman equivalent of the gladiator games. And when did Roman emperors basically put together gladiator games? When their popularity was sinking. They used it as a distraction. That's where we get the term bread and circuses from, because during gladiator games, free bread was thrown into the crowd. So it was bread and circuses to distract people as far as the evil qualities of the emperor that was responsible for their economic misery. Then they would give them gladiator games. And consequently, the ruling class has given us professional sports to keep us ignorant. So again, if we actually investigated a lot of the statistics that has been reported by the mass media about this virus, we understand they possess as much validity as a conclusion from, say, like a hypothetical example. If a study was conducted and 100 members of a neo-Nazi organization were queried and asked if they hate black people, and all 100 said yes, and then the media reported, hey, all white people hate black people, and that's a fact. I mean, some of the methodologies of some of these scientific studies used to spread fear about the lethality of this virus have the robustness is on par with this hypothetical survey I just told you, like with neo-Nazis. It's so poor, but yet they've been used to spread total misinformation about this virus across the world that billions of people have accepted. So the fact that a great segment of the entire world's population lived an entire year, almost a year, without once studying how the statistics that they embraced to act like Karens and scream at their neighbors that don't wear a mask or don't socially distance, is a reason enough to label this year as the year of stupidity and blind compliance. And finally, I frequently encounter the highest level of blind compliance and greatest pushback regarding monetary topics, and have often observed the same level, if not a higher absence of critical thinking when it applies to certain discussions regarding Bitcoin. So whenever I pose a question, hey, how can a currency that is denominated in another currency that is hated, the US dollar, right? Because people that buy Bitcoin say, hey, the US dollar sucks, but yet it's denominated and priced in that currency, serve as a solution for the problem of the US dollar. That makes no sense, number one. Number two, I've asked, how can a currency have the exact same qualities of the US dollar, but yet be the solution? Meaning it's a digital fiat currency backed by no tangible commodity. And on the worst side, on the negative of Bitcoin versus US dollar, it's much more trackable than the US dollar because of the blockchain. But the only positive aspect is that it has a finite limit to the amount created. Okay, so we're not going to go into Satoshi Nakamoto because nobody knows his identity, right? So we have this argument, hey, is Satoshi Nakamoto some cypherpunk that really wanted to free the world? Or was he part of the ruling class that his Trojan horse that was just masquerading as a savior to get people to adopt digital currency? So regardless of that whole debate, okay, I don't even want to get into that because that's a whole nother huge debate. if we just look at the characteristic, right? There's only one thing that's better. There's a finite limit to the amount than the US dollar or any other fiat currency. There's a finite limit to the amount created, which, while better, this positive quality is not even true if Bitcoin futures come back, because they're suspended, as probably most Bitcoin traders don't even know that about the history of the futures, and I'll tell you why in a second. And then if a new Bitcoin ETF is introduced in the future, which all Bitcoin advocates say is a positive thing, I say it's a very negative thing, because they have zero understanding of how ETFs and futures actually work and how the ruling class uses that to manipulate the price of that asset. Because of these three qualities, one's marginally good, right? Fiat finite creation, but that can easily be dissolved by bringing back Bitcoin futures or a new Bitcoin ETF. And the other two are terrible. So there's a complete absence of demonstrated logic in the expressed belief of a new currency. I mean, relatively new, right? Because Bitcoin's been around since what, 2008 or so? Or was it a little earlier than that? I can't recall the exact date off the top of my head. But, relatively new currency that's priced in the very currency people view as problematic. The US dollar, the euro, the Korean won, or whatever, can be a valid solution to freeing themselves from this problematic currency. It makes absolutely no sense. So an analogous example would be if the current currency in use were potatoes. And in this hypothetical scenario, let's assume, hey, people say we have to come up with this alternate currency. In this case, it was Bitcoin, but say Bitcoin doesn't exist because we see the purchasing power of potatoes decreasing for a continuous century, just like it has with the US dollar. So it's a reason people convert US dollar into Bitcoin. And to preserve our savings from being continuously eroded, we must convert our potatoes into some other form of currency. So in order to do that, in this hypothetical example, say someone buys an investment home in addition to the primary home in which they already live in. And so they say, at least by converting, devaluing potatoes into a hard asset, that's going to preserve my savings from being destroyed every year if I would save it in the form of potatoes. However, it's also well known that it's hard to find a buyer in the exact time window in which you will want to liquidate your hard asset of your investment home that would be willing to swap a comparable home for the home you want to get rid of. So in other words, the only way you can really liquidate your investment home so you have the money, the currency you need to buy other goods and services once that time comes, is to liquidate it back into potatoes. Because like I said, Bitcoin is priced in US dollars, euros, or whatever fiat currencies out there. So consequently, you understand if you ever wanted to use your investment home to purchase other goods and services in the future, you have to sell your investment home and then receive potatoes that have greatly devalued for the past 10 years in return. So how is your problem of saving in potatoes solved with the fact that you just bought another asset that you have to convert back to the horrible currency in order to use it to buy anything? Of course, is this analogous to buying Bitcoin priced in US dollar, euros, yuan, won, or yen? Of course it is. But and I already have heard sometimes people offer a counter argument, right, to this absolutely valid argument. Many will say, hey, you can make the same argument with gold because gold's priced internationally US dollars. Although China and Russia, of course, are trying to break people's connections to gold to a US dollar price, right, by trading gold in their own currencies. But their currencies are still fiat currencies, so no better than in the potato example I just gave you. This is true. Even though I'm an advocate of gold, I can understand logically, rationally, from an intellectual standpoint, this is true. However, there is a divergence in the concepts of value and price between Bitcoin and gold, and this is where gold makes the better money, because gold's real value is not its price. Bankers have fooled us, and academia drill that into our head, thinking, oh, the value of gold is $1,900 an ounce or whatever it is, $1,880 an ounce, and they will tie our perception of its value to price, but its real value is its weight in grams. If you know anything about historical periods of real gold standards, it was never tied to a fiat currency. Its real value was always valued in weight, which would either be grams or troy ounces. And consequently, its inherent value is immutable, it's unchangeable. Okay, unless you're on a different planet right? Where gravity is different. So the weight would differ, right, on a different planet. But as long as you're on planet Earth, the value of gold is immutable. And bankers have only fooled us into conflating value and price with gold. However, the problem with Bitcoin, and this is where gold has an advantage, is that its value cannot be another characteristic separate from price. For example, one can state the real value of Bitcoin is the piece of the blockchain that stores ownership and transaction data, because the blockchain's value differs wildly depending upon whether it's being used to store data about Bitcoin currency transactions or ownership information about Bitcoin, or if it's used to store intellectual property data to protect IP of a photograph or pop song. So consequently, Bitcoin's value is equivalent with its price. Therefore, a true gold standard can never use a gold basis priced in US dollars or any other fiat currency, despite academic textbooks lying to us and telling us that this lie is the truth. So gold does not have the same unsolvable conundrums as does Bitcoin on this matter. So because I've spoken in the past decade with many Bitcoin owners, not all, but most, that lose their mind and throw their critical thinking skills out the window if they ever had them. When engaged in the above argument, they're proof often that Bitcoin is better sound money. They'll argue Bitcoin is better sound money than gold because I've made more profits with Bitcoin than gold. Obviously, this argument is really, really stupid because it depends on when you bought Bitcoin and when you bought gold. Just like with stocks, it depends on your buying and selling price. I know people that have lost a lot of money in Bitcoin because they believed all the Bitcoin experts like Tom Lee and all those other people. When Bitcoin went to 20,000, they said, this is the next stop to 40,000 and then 250,000. So I actually know people that bought Bitcoin at around $19,500 because they believed it. They say, hey, there's no risk. All these experts are saying it's going to at least $40,000 in 3 years. So at a minimum, I'll double my money. And then they proceeded to lose because it crashed to $3,000, almost all their money. But I told them once it went to 19,000, I said, you're going to lose it. It's going to go back to 10,000. All my SK Wealth Academy Patreons that were with me back then know that because they know I predicted the exact top of Bitcoin at 20,000. I said it was going to get cut to 10,000. Once it got cut to 10, they know I told them it was going to get cut to 5,000. And that wasn't even aggressive enough because it went to 3,000. So a lot of people bought in almost at the peak of Bitcoin because I thought it was a pit stop to $250,000. It's going to go to 40,000, then 100, then 250,000 in just a 3 or 4 year time frame. But some did cut their losses when it went to like 10,000, divested and bought gold at less than $1,200, and since then have made up a lot of their losses because gold's risen to around 1,900 now. So they made very large profits in gold, lost a tremendous amount of money in Bitcoin. So just to state that one made more profits with a currency than another proves it is a better, more sound, more fundamental currency, is devoid of any type of logic. And again, just shows you that we do indeed live in the year of the Unthinking Compliant Pod. And even if Bitcoin were, okay, let me play devil's advocate with myself. Even if Bitcoin were trading at $50,000 right now, and gold were concurrently at $1,500, it's not, but let's say it was, that still would not make this very popular and false argument embraced by a lot of Bitcoin advocates. Like I said, not all, but a lot, but most. It would not make that argument valid even if this were the case, because a vastly more profitable asset does not make an asset a better quality asset than a less profitable asset. It makes it a better investment, sure, but that's very different than being a better asset. So of course, any asset that has gone hyperbolic, like .com stocks during the late 1990s and early 2000s, in which companies had market caps of billions of dollars with zero profits, zero revenues. They provide prime examples of the hollowness of such an argument. Because during the .com boom, just because a company's shares soared spectacularly, say from $1 a share to $100 or $500 a share, that never meant that particular company was a better asset than another company whose shares only doubled in price over that same time period. If you believe that explosive profits had a direct correlation to asset quality during that time, then you may have bought a company with zero revenues and profits whose shares yielded 10,000% yields on the basis that that company was a much better company than one you could have bought for a fraction of that price at $10 million. Say they had positive cash flow, low debt to working capital ratio, positive growth outlook, tons of cash on hand, and was a leader in market share in its industry. You would have chose the much worse asset over the much better one for a much cheaper price. So because of this fatal flaw in logic, you could have ended up paying $100 million to a company that went to zero versus paying 10% of that $10 million for a company that was a much greater quality asset that would continue to rise in value over time. So of course, not to piss these Bitcoin advocates here that don't understand my intellectual arguments here, I've also met a minority, not a lot, but a minority of Bitcoin owners that truly understand this argument. I've met some that say, hey, I absolutely agree with you on these points because they are just facts. And I want to laud them at being, the 1 in 100,000 that understand it despite all the pressure to discard sound logic when it comes to that point. So just to ensure the unthinking pod mentality does not proliferate regarding my commentary about Bitcoin, because I know it's unpopular, as often unthinking pods extrapolate my comments into a completely illogical, unrelated commentary. I support Bitcoin as a form of currency. I believe it should exist because guess what? I believe in open monetary competition. Because I think in open monetary competition, but that would also mean that the powers that be should allow gold, physical gold, to be a form of money in the widespread economy. But they're not. So, but because whenever you have open monetary competition, guess what? The people will decide, right? So let the people decide. I'm all for that because the best currency will always rise to the top. And that's exactly what I want. So I never would want any currency band. Let there be free, open monetary competition. And furthermore, again, if one doesn't understand how futures and exchange traded funds allows price manipulation by bankers of that asset, then one understands nothing beyond the garbage you may have learned in your MBA program or your undergraduate business program. My patrons, when I predicted the exact top of Bitcoin at 20,000 at the end of 2017, they know because I explained the reason I gave them for my prediction that was going to get cut in half to 10,000. It was, I said, the introduction of Bitcoin futures created this last parabolic leg rise in Bitcoin price in 2017 to $20,000. And I said that once the fervor, right, of Bitcoin futures is so positive for the price of Bitcoin, it's going to continue driving it up. I said once that incorrect false belief passed, that the bankers would then slam the price of Bitcoin and use the futures markets to do that. And again, the reason I gave that explanation was because I understand that bankers have used futures markets to slam the price of gold and silver repeatedly. Even within the past couple months, they've done it again and again in gold and silver. So why would they use this ability to slam gold and silver prices repeatedly over decades, the past couple of decades, but ignore this power that was granted to them in the Bitcoin futures market? So anybody that's actually studied retroactively the collapse of Bitcoin from $20,000 to $3,000 in less than a year knows that the conclusion was that Bitcoin futures trading platform enabled that rapid price collapse, just as I predicted before it happened. And in fact, that I also even predicted a significant dump just earlier this month in gold and silver prices based upon price manipulation in gold and silver futures market. So it's also zero coincidence. A lot of people don't know this, which is unbelievable to me, that you could trade Bitcoin and not even know this, that the CBOE suspended Bitcoin futures trading in March of 2019. Like, a lot of people don't even know. So how can you trade a commodity when you don't understand the fundamentals about what is affecting price in that particular market? So with this price manipulation mechanism suspended, Bitcoin immediately rose from $3,800 to over $11,000 in just 4 months time, 4 months. So if one was invested in Bitcoin during these periods and made a lot of profit, but without knowing the relationship, the very intimate relationship between futures trading and the price, I consider those Bitcoin traders as extremely lucky because they just lucked out. I mean, they didn't know about this relationship between that price crashes in the past, and then as soon as the futures market was suspended, that was directly related to the price spike, tremendous price spike in less than 4 months in Bitcoin prices. So, it'd just be like if they suspended the gold and silver futures markets in London and in New York, I would bet my life, because I understand how this manipulation works, I would bet my life that, of course, you have to make sure it's properly suspended. So I would have to, before I bet my life and sign my name on a contract, I would have to oversee and come up with all the basic description of how these markets would have to be suspended to ensure that futures markets are not influencing the gold and silver price. But I would bet my life that gold and silver would soar in price after that event happened, just like it did with Bitcoin, the suspension of the Bitcoin futures market. So in any event, what else do I want to speak about? Anything else? Okay. Sorry for this little brain freeze here. Okay. Oh, I know. There's one other thing I do want to discuss before I leave. So let me just say that in regard to the same topic, that so many people get their panties in a bunch, including male sports fans that are the equivalent of Karens when an athlete says something like, at the end of the day, hey, win or lose, my life is still going to be great. It's okay to fail, because star athletes have said this in the past. And that is the truth. That's the truth, right? If they're making $150 million, win or lose a finals, and a lot of sports journalists will say, hey, that person is not serious about winning a championship because he's not dedicating his entire life, every single breath of their existence to winning this final, and they actually realize there's something more important to life than just winning a championship, which every sane, I would think, only insane people that were professional athletes would think that way. That you don't realize, because guess what? When your career ends, if your whole existence, you've justified it by being an athlete and winning a championship, you're going to go into severe, deep depression when you don't get that type of adulation from fans anymore. They're just praising how great your athletic skills are and worshiping at your athletic altar. Because, of course, if you want to be really happy in life, you have to find purpose beyond winning a championship. I can't say, I'm not saying that doesn't have to be a goal of someone that wishes to reach the pinnacle of athleticism, but if they're smart enough to realize that their whole existence shouldn't revolve around that, they get reamed. And that just shows you, again, the complete lack of critical thinking. Because if you're one of those people that say that, then you don't want a person basically to have happiness. You say happiness is not relevant, because you cannot have happiness without true meaning and true purpose in your life. And because your professional athletic career can only last a certain limited amount of time, that cannot be the true purpose and meaning in your life. Really, if you think your meaning in life, the reason you were born was to throw a ball in a hoop or kick a ball into a goal, then I feel bad for those people that think that's the reason they were put on this planet and that's their whole purpose. So in any event, for also those that source news from and a lot of beliefs from Joe Rogan's podcast, because it's the most popular podcast in the world, I believe doing that is incredibly foolish. Because while his podcast can be incredibly entertaining, and then a wealth of information passed on by a very diverse number of people, speaking about diverse number of subjects, when Joe got paid $100 million to move to Spotify, I'm not hating on them. That's great, right? That's great. Get yours, right? But even then, I thought $100 million was a bargain for Spotify, right? Because if you look at, I think, like how much the market cap of Spotify went up immediately after that was announced, is way over $100 million. I think. Don't take my word on that. But in any event, you know that Spotify is going to be a better negotiator than Joe Rogan, right? So if they come in, I don't know if that was the initial offered amount, if they came in 100 million, but they came in anywhere close, like 90 million. You know, they always give themselves a lot of wiggle room, so they probably would have been willing to go up to 150, 200 million. But he took the deal for 100 million. But I recall a podcast from a year ago in which he kept saying $100 million was a trillion, or 100 million was a billion, and 100 billion was a trillion. So maybe he thought Spotify was paying $1 billion, because he actually stated on a podcast, $100 million is a billion. I don't understand how you can not think that $100 million is, no, it's $100 million. That's why it's 100 million. A billion is a different amount of money than 100 million. But he kept saying 100 million is a billion and 100 billion is a trillion. So in any event, any type of podcast such as his that uses Google and Snopes that cater to confirmation bias as his Bible for fact checking. Because just watch the Creepy Line documentary. There's a documentary about Google called The Creepy Line. You understand that massive political biases, massive ruling class biases are programmed into their search result algorithm. So unless you're searching for something as simple as like, hey, what's the capital of Uruguay? It's Montevideo, and you're going to receive massively deceptive answers to almost all of your other searches using the Google search engine. If it has to do anything with a political narrative or even a scientific narrative, you're going to receive whatever answers they want you to believe. So in any event, you know, the fact that his podcast always is using Google to validate their guests, what their guests are saying, or to invalidate it, that makes it an incredibly bad source of news. But a lot of people use his podcast to validate their beliefs or invalidate them. So all I'm saying is that if you use that as a source of news, that's incredibly foolish and incredibly unthinking compliant pod-like behavior. So in any event, I've covered how anyone with common sense still would not be clinging to the ruling class narrative that that the virus is massively dangerous and requires further lockdowns, just by drawing simple conclusions from basic observations. Because if the virus is as dangerous as politicians state, then can you easily find dozens of examples of politicians repeatedly disobeying their own mandates that they say are there to protect us for our own good. So if they're really dangerous, you know, politicians they care about their lives first and foremost over everyone else's. They would not be breaking their mandates. They would be socially distancing, wearing face masks, staying at home as they order us to do if they really believe the virus was dangerous. So the fact that they're just flaunting a total disregard and disobedience for their own mandates because they're not subject to the same amount of draconian fines and imprisonment from violating their own mandates, that you know it's not dangerous. You just have to observe their behavior. This is common sense. And also, if you look at just things that mass media will not discuss, like if it would really were as contagious and dangerous as people said, then there should have been already a devastating outbreak among homeless people, right? Because homeless people don't have health care. Their health is much worse than everyone else, so they already have comorbidity factors that would make the virus more lethal to them if they actually contracted it. And by now, LA has more than 70,000 homeless people. There's more than 70,000 homeless people right now in the city of Los Angeles, the majority of whom are not wearing face masks, not socially distancing, in very densely populated encampments in which disease just spreads like wildfire. But yet, I have not heard of one incident in which there's not been one story of an encampment where like half the homeless population in that encampment was wiped out by this virus. Why? When you would think if it's as contagious, as dangerous as they say, that should have happened a long time ago. And the same argument would also apply to prison populations. You would think by now massive viral deaths would have happened in every single prison in America, except maybe SHU at Pelican Bay, because they have a 23 lockdown isolation period enforced on all prisoners there that drive them crazy. So besides those types of inhumane prisons, you would think in all other densely populated prison populations, you should have had massive outbreaks and deaths from the virus, and that's not been reported anywhere again. So I literally could provide at least a dozen more instances in which common sense, if we all had it, would prove that at a minimum, okay, politicians enforcing draconian lockdown measures do not believe themselves the virus is dangerous. They have enough information where they know it's not dangerous. So in podcast 152, I discussed evidence of the rapid tests for infection being completely unscientific. Yet no one cares that the evidence shows they're completely unscientific, because I think only like 100 people listen to that podcast. I'll put the link to it below. It's 152 SK Wealth Academy podcast. But yet, just last week, Elon Musk, because he's famous, said, hey, I was tested 4 times in one day. 2 of my tests were positive, 2 were negative. So he said, it's obvious these rapid tests for infection are completely rubbish and trash. That's exactly what I said weeks ago, but nobody listened. But you have a famous person say, and then everybody retweets it and says, hey, maybe we shouldn't trust these tests. And that's what I mean, again, by complete lack of critical thought in the entire world today. People require a famous person to say something to believe in it, which should be the exact opposite. You should basically only be validating or invalidating something based upon the facts, not whether a famous person says it or a non-famous person says it. So again, here we have people exercising to the nth degree non-intellectual analysis to determine whether something is true or not. So these people perceive that the only reason, okay, let me tell you again that, as I said at the start of this, some people say, hey, you can't say that this is non-critical or critical because you're just stating that only people that disagree with your opinion can't engage in critical thinking. So again, that argument is a non-intellectual argument, because that is not what I am saying. I'm saying that only people that have never investigated the methodologies behind the test, right, that are spreading fear about, oh, so many people are testing positive now, even though they're asymptomatic and have no symptoms. So no, people that have never researched the methodology behind this test and never researched the methodologies behind the statistics being produced to elicit fear all around the world about the lethality of this virus are idiots. That's all I'm saying. I said, if you've looked into it and done your own research and came to your own conclusions, then I'm not saying you're an idiot. But if you don't have a scientific background, and you don't understand the methodologies that you researched, then you would need to consult someone with a scientific background to explain to you these methodologies about the tests and about the studies that produce all this data about the lethality of the virus. Because you cannot conclude, and if you have researched this, you don't understand the science, and you still conclude that the narratives pushed in the media and by politicians and the wealthy are correct, then I would say you're still an idiot and you're not exercising any type of critical thinking. So let me just make two last stories I want to cover. One is about the Sewol ferry disaster in South Korea. And this is an incident in which 300 people died, over 200 teenage students that were going on a class trip to visit the island of Jeju Island off the coast of South Korea. I saw an interview with a survivor. Okay, so I think she was 14 at the time the disaster happened. Now she's 18 or 19. And it's unbelievable because she went through a life and death situation, right? Where even her lack of critical thinking, she was still able to survive. But to this day, right, when they interviewed her just this year, she said she still holds the captain. What happened in that, if you don't know, the captain fled the ship. The captain said, it's dangerous to leave your cabin, stay in your cabin. So all the people listened. And even when their cabins were filling up with water, they still stayed in their cabin until it was too late. And then by that time, the waters came flooding in and they, couldn't make it out and they all drowned, okay? Whereas if they had just jumped overboard with life jackets, even if they couldn't swim, the South Korean Coast Guard came minutes later after the ferry sank. So at worst, they probably would have been hypothermic, but still all survived. So she even alluded to that. She said, if the captain had just not been such a coward and ordered us to stay in our cabins, if he had just told us, hey, get off the boat, I'm abandoning ship, you're all on your own, even though that was a total complete jerk thing to do. She said, if the captain just warned us and ordered us to leave our cabins, she said, not one student would have died. But she places all the blame on the captain. There's no personal accountability on her part. No critical thinking, saying I have to think for myself. No self-reliance. And so it's amazing to me 5 years later, even though she went through a life and death situation, her critical thinking skills are as abhorrent as they were during that disaster. In fact, if she were to be in another life and death situation, which obviously she still relies on authority to tell her what to do, because she was saying that in an interview this year, like, I would fear that if critical thinking were necessary to live and die in another life and death situation, this girl would die. She's not going to save herself. And finally, for people that inexplicably still believe their government and people like Bill Gates always have our best interests at heart, have no clue about their sinister, ulterior, misanthropic motives, consider this news story. I want to give credit where credit's due because I didn't know about this, but I heard about it on the Corbett Report. So if you don't know about them, you can check them out. They always have good information. The Corbett, Corbett report on YouTube. And he mentioned that there was a letter that was released in Canada and Nova Scotia dated September 19th on official Department of Lands and Forestry letterhead that was signed by someone that was a biologist, and the letter was advising that they had reintroduced wolves into that area and they become super aggressive and perhaps had bred, so the wolf pack was really large, and they advised everyone to, quote, if they spot a wolf, to, quote, back away slowly while remaining calm. Do not turn and run, end quote. And then later, when, of course, people were extremely fearful about the safety of their children, saying, why would you introduce these wolves and then not control the population? They overbred. Now they're going to put our children at risk. And they started writing and calling about this official government letter. The Lands and Forestry Department in Nova Scotia responded and said, the letter was a hoax. We don't know where it came from. It's fake, quote, it's fake. We do not know who circulated it or why, end quote. So, okay, you say, oh, okay, well, someone just fabricated this hoax. That's pretty bad. But the truth of the matter is that, you know who fabricated it? The Canadian military. So the Canadian military actually fabricated that letter without the knowledge without ever informing the Department of Lands and Forestry, because they were doing a propaganda experiment. They wanted to see how many people believed it, although it was totally untrue, and they were actually going to play the sound of wolves howling over loudspeakers around this town. So they would believe that there had been an infiltration explosion of the wolf population that would endanger their children. So people say, why would they do that? Why would they study how people would react? Well, to me, the answer is obvious, because already that they've seen that they can control people with all the propaganda that they have disseminated about the virus, because the virus is not lethal, it's not dangerous to anyone that is healthy, has a strong immune system. So they've been super successful in disseminating propaganda in that manner. They wanted to see how far they can push propaganda, because, hey, maybe people will finally push back on the propaganda of the virus and we won't be able to control them that way. So we need other means to control people. So perhaps it will have to do with some fake threat like wolves or other things to keep people inside their homes. So that's why they're doing it. The answer is so obvious to me, and I can't understand why people can't see that. Okay, so that wraps up this particular podcast. If you want to support me, thanks so much for people that have supported me in the past. You can support me through $5 a month donation at Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/skwealthacademy. If you want to support the launch, thank you so much to all the beautiful people that have donated to my SK Wealth Academy online academy launch, which is upcoming. It's going to happen soon. I'm trying really hard to make it work, but I have to be able to go home, because I'm stuck in COVID lockdown travel hell right now. So for the entirety of this year, I haven't been able to go home. So once I'm able to go home, I'll launch my company, and then thanks so much to all the donors. I will have some kind of benefit for all the donors if you would like to donate, because this campaign is going to end in just a few weeks. So please go to gofundme.com /F like fight /SK Wealth Academy. And finally, for the $5 a month donors on Patreon, which you can find out more about the benefits at patreon.com/SK Wealth Academy. You get 2 extra long format bonus podcasts every month. You get 3 to 6 short videos every single week about financial advice, about gold and silver analysis, about stock market analysis. And I cover both financial topics and critical thinking topics and academic topics and intellectual topics as well. So you get a good mix of both topics, although during the week it's all finance, during the weekends it's non-finance, and in the podcast, the 2 long format podcasts you receive every month, one is of a financial nature and the second one is of a non-financial nature. So that about wraps it up. Thanks so much for watching. Blessings to all of you. Remain intensely curious, remain immensely courageous, and don't be an unthinking compliant pod. Take care.